Tonight we're in Worcester Cathedral, and welcome to Question Time. Good evening to you at home, good evening to our audience here, and to our panel, the Economic Secretary, to the Treasury, Sajid Javid, Labour's Shadow Climate Change Minister, Luciana Berger, from the Liberal Democrats, Simon Hughes, their Deputy Leader, and two leaders, Natalie Bennett of the Green Party and Nigel Farage of UKIP. Thank you very much. And our first question tonight comes from Thomas Doyle, please.
Is George Osborne's economic plan finally working?
George Osborne's economic plan, is it finally working, Luciana Berger?
Well, we've heard today that the Chancellor has tried to spin the growth figures as a victory. And if the Chancellor was to come out into the country and to speak to people up and down the country, he would know that people are facing a really, really tough time. There is a cost of living crisis in this country. People are really struggling to get by, and we heard only just this week that 350,000 people in our country had to go to a food bank because they couldn't afford to feed themselves and their families. I want to see people in work. There are over 2.5 million people in this country that don't have a job, which includes nearly 1 million young people. And I want to see the government come forward with a proper plan for jobs and growth. We don't have one. And how many more people is it going to take for the Chancellor to listen and get on with it and get a proper plan for jobs and growth? There is a few things, and many things, in fact, that he can do, and I'd like to see him do immediately to get people into work. And firstly, I'd like him to repeat the banker's bonus tax so that we can get young people into work and we can build homes that this country desperately needs. He could reduce VAT temporarily to stimulate demand. He could reduce VAT in the construction sector. He could do all manner of things, and he doesn't have a plan, and it's people up and down this country that are suffering as a result of it.
Well, Sajid Javid, there's quite a long list there.
I think today's news was welcome, but to put
what's this, the 0.3%?
Yes,
GDP
but it shows that, first of all, the economy is healing, but equally, it also shows there's a long way to go. The road is going to be bumpy ahead, but we're on the right track. You know, before I came into politics, which was 3 years ago, I used to do a tremendous amount of business in emerging markets, you know, the fastest growing countries in the world, Brazil, China, India, countries of that type. I saw for myself just how fastly those countries are growing and expanding. And as a result, these countries today are eating our breakfast, they're having our lunch, and if we don't change our ways, they're also going to be having our supper. That's the simple truth of it. And when the Prime Minister talks about the global race, that we are in a global race, that's what he means. The world doesn't owe us a living, and we have to fight hard in this global space to succeed, and the government's job is to make sure we equip British citizens to succeed in that global race. And what have we done about it? First of all, it meant when we came to office that we had to deal with the world's largest deficit of any of the large 20 leading nations. We've cut that by a third. That has brought economic credibility. That has lowered interest rates. That has brought investment. And Luciana mentioned jobs, and she's absolutely right to talk about jobs. 1.25 million new private sector jobs have been created in the last 3 years. There's more people employed in the private sector than at any time in our history, and we created jobs as a country last year faster than any other G7 nation. And that is something that we should be proud of. And I'm not going to pretend for a second that we don't have serious economic challenges, both ones that were grown at home and ones that come from abroad. But this government is walking up to those challenges, confronting them and dealing with them, rather than sticking its head in the sand and pretending the problem can just go away.
All right, well, thank you very much for that. Why is it that the IMF doesn't seem that keen on what you're doing, if you think it's so right? And why do the credit rating agencies not seem to entirely approve of what you're doing?
Well, first of all, the IMF will actually be coming to the UK very soon. It comes every year. It goes to all the leading economies. It does a full, proper assessment. And I think it'll be interesting to see what they say, especially in light of today's news. So I'd rather wait to see what the IMF says after a full analysis. Now, the rating agencies, I'm pleased you mentioned that, David. But it's the rating agencies, the two rating agencies that have downgraded our credit rating, that's S&P and Fitch. They've both said the same thing, which is that if Britain deviates from its deficit reduction plan, its plan to make sure that our country once again starts living within its means, they would downgrade us again. And if we actually look at the two countries out there that haven't been downgraded, so they're AAA across the board from all the rating agencies, so that's Germany and that is Canada. If you look at both those countries, they fixed the roof when the sun was shining. The previous government ran a deficit from 2001, long before there was an international crisis, and we're having to pay for the price of that today.
I only mention it because it was George Osborne, wasn't it, who said that it was essential that Britain wasn't downgraded. But there you go. Nigel Farage.
Well, is the strategy working? No. This coalition was put together to get rid of the annual deficit. The plan was that over the 5 years, the deficit would disappear. The deficit is still running at £130 billion a year. If we go on like this, by the end of this 5-year Parliament, our national debt will have increased by 40% in the lifetime of this Parliament. So the answer is no, it is not working, and Sajid talks about living within our means. We've barely dented the deficit over the course of this last 2.5 years, so it isn't working. Growth is, clearly as these figures show, anemic, and the international community looks on at the UK, not just because of the downgrades, but they look on and they're pretty pessimistic and pretty bearish about the outlook. And I think that what George Osborne is going to need to do is to be very much more radical, and I think we're going to have some real cuts in government spending, and particularly if one looks at the £60 billion a year that we're spending on the Quangos. Again, the Tory party talked about a bonfire of the Quangos. We need to see it. And the other thing I think that needs to happen is we've got to reduce taxation for the low paid. Because if you get them out of a tax system, no tax on minimum wage, that's money that will go into people's pockets and actually get spent in the high street. Something radical needs to happen.
Okay. Everybody in this audience is experiencing what's going on here, so I'm sure there are many different views that I'd like to hear from. The woman in the third row there, and then I go to you at the back there. Yes.
You say, well, the government says that the state of the economy is improving, but isn't the 0.3% just means that it's within the definition of not being a triple dip recession, because we're still in the same position we were in 5 years ago? So
it's just a token. Simon Hughes, as a supporter of the coalition.
Well, can I link that question to the initial question? Is it finally working? No, it's not finally working, because it was never going to be a quick fix. And Nigel, in one respect, is right, although he then went on to say something that's completely inconsistent with something else he believes.
What was that? This is very complicated, isn't it?
When we joined the coalition, we did so because we believed we needed a stronger economy. We needed to rescue Britain from paying 120 million quid a day in interest on our debts. Not sustainable. Personal debt at its highest level ever, and an inability to understand that you have to make the books balance. So we went into a coalition in the national interest to do that, but also clear we needed a fairer society, because Labour and the Tories had left the gap between the rich and the poor wider than it had ever been, with ridiculous bonuses, obscene, while other people were struggling at the bottom. So that's what we went to do. We then have done the steps that Sajid has talked about, and many of the things have succeeded. You can tick off successes. Interest rates are low. Inflation is low. The deficit has been reduced by a third. We have created more than 1 million new jobs.
Are you attracted by what Luciana's been saying about the other things that could be done to stimulate the economy?
There isn't a difference of view, surely, in politics, that we want unemployment to be as low as possible. We want as many people to be in work as possible. But we have to do it in a way that is sustainable and great. And we have done that. There are more people in work. Unemployment has, since a year ago...
There's 2.5 million people unemployed.
Look, when I came into Parliament and Mrs Thatcher was the Prime Minister, we had 18% unemployment. Unemployment in this constituency, I checked, is something of the order between 4 and 5%. Youth unemployment is lower now than it was when you left office. and that had started when you were still in power. So I'm not taking lectures, Lucia. You weren't in Parliament then, but I'm not taking lectures from colleagues in the Labour Party who didn't deal with this issue. But I'm clear we need to do other things. We need, clearly, to go on very slowly and steadily, making sure we get growth, manufacturing investment, money for small businesses to grow. And I'm committed to making sure that the people at the bottom end don't pay the price and the people at the top end pay more. And if I can end with this, we have been taking low paid out of tax. We started, the tax threshold was 6,440 quid. It's now 9,400 quid. Next year it'll be 10,000 quid. We're trying to make sure people on lower incomes pay less and people on high incomes pay more. And that, for me, is the right way to go in very, very difficult circumstances.
I think that Thomas Doyle, behind your question, presumably, is this sort of glimmer of light, wasn't it? Because that was what you were on about with the news today. The person up there in the second row from the back. Yes.
Going back to Nigel's point about the outlook for the UK economy being rather pessimistic, surely wouldn't it be even more pessimistic if we left the European Union, of which, even going by your figures, 40% of our exports go to, which is simply too large to just brush aside and say isn't important?
Well, if you look at the cost of the European Union to the British economy, if you look at the cost of the EU to the British economy, I mean, there's the top-line figure of the £53 million a day we pay away as a membership fee, but there are some very interesting academic reports saying that actually the cost of unnecessary regulation being put on British industry is perhaps costing 4 or 5% of our annual GDP. I promise you one thing. Britain not being a member of the European Union does not mean that Mercedes will not want to sell their cars in this country. We will go on doing business with Europe. We'll be free to open up trade deals with the rest of the world,
but we do that
which
anyway.
we're currently forbidden from doing.
We do it anyway.
We are forbidden from making our own trade deal with any other country in the world, and we've got all these English-speaking countries
and we're currently negotiating a trade deal with the States as a European Union.
No. The European Union can make our trade policy. We cannot make our own trade policy, and the sooner we get rid of some of the lunacies of climate change policy that we've signed up to in Brussels and excessive employment regulation, we'll be a wealthier country.
Natalie Bennett.
Well, I'm going to largely ignore Mr Farage's magic recipe. He's going to do one thing. We're going to leave the European Union and that solves all of our problems. Because I think simple recipes like that are not the way forward. What we need to do is look at our own economy. And, you know, Mr Hughes says he's worried about how the poor and the disadvantaged are doing. So he's part of a government that's just seen in the last year the wealth of the wealthiest 10% of people go up 11%. The Sunday Times rich list. There's 11 new billionaires in Britain. We can all welcome into Britain. Isn't that wonderful? I don't think it is. And we have, it's not just, Luciana referred to the unemployed, but it's not just the unemployed. You know, 2.67 million of them young people. But it's also the 1 in 10 people who are working fewer hours than they'd like to be working, who are struggling to get by with less than full-time hours, and the 1 in 5 people who are on less than a living wage. After 13 years of a Labour government, we have a minimum wage that's significantly below the living wage, and that simply is not good enough. We need to rebuild our economy with jobs you can build a life on, bring manufacturing and food production back to Britain, and rebuild our strong local economies around small business.
Would you increase borrowing? Is that where you do it? I mean, the whole government position, as has been explained by Sajid, is about the borrowing and getting it down. Would you increase borrowing now?
What we need to do, what matters is what you do with the borrowing. At the moment, we're borrowing.
Would you increase it? Would you increase it?
We're borrowing for things like Trident. We're borrowing to cut the corporate tax rate.
Yeah, but that doesn't answer my question. Would you increase borrowing in principle?
Yes, because we believe austerity is the wrong direction.
And would you increase borrowing?
The IMF says we're playing with fire by following austerity.
Would you increase borrowing?
This government is borrowing £245 billion more than it said it would.
So would you reduce borrowing then?
Well, we have to see, in terms of what will happen come the next general election. We will set out our tax and spending plans.
Yeah, but you're coming to a general election. Are you going to increase borrowing? You're going to say to your voters, we're going to increase borrowing, we're going to spend, or we're going to stick with the Tory plans.
The challenge is we don't know what the economy is going to be like in 2.5 years, and we have a responsibility to the British electorate and the British public not to make promises that we can't keep. There's parties around this table that have made promises.
But we do know we have to. That's not true. That's not true. Ed Balls on LBC last week said that that wasn't the case.
If you're against every spending cut that this government has introduced, every tax rise this government has introduced, then clearly you must want borrowing to go up. There's no other way to do it.